Okay, I think we'll just get started. So, hello everyone, and welcome to this Worker Story Project event tonight, titled Why Do Worker Stories Matter?" So, my name's Suki Sanga. I am a trade union activist, a trade union organiser, and I'm also a member of the Worker Stories Project team, and I'll be chairing or facilitating tonight's discussion. Before I get started, just a couple of technical things. You'll notice that we are recording the session tonight. And the only reason for why we're recording it is that we do hope to post the meeting on our social media platforms, because we hope that some of the discussions that we have tonight, some of the content that we covered tonight, will help encourage other people to submit their stories, share their stories. So that's really the purpose of the recording. So if there is anyone on the call tonight that maybe doesn't want to appear in the recording, there are obviously a couple of things that you can do on Zoom. You can change your name. You can hit the wee dots in the top right hand corner of your screen. That will allow you to change your name, and you can also turn your video off as well. So if you feel that you do want to sort of hide your identity in that way, then please take those steps now. In terms of tech, really just the basic stuff. I'm sure people have been on hundreds of Zoom meetings over the last couple of months, but really just to ensure that people do remain on mute throughout the meeting, or certainly until we get to the sort of Q&A discussion part of the meeting. The session will last for around an hour. And each of the panelists tonight will speak for around 5 minutes each, and then we'll open up to a kind of informal discussion, like I say, kind of Q&A type segment. And we're also looking to use the chat function at that point, but I'll give you a bit more information around how we plan on doing that. Just to say, I know some people are already posting, but use the chat function. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, who you are, where you're from, what you do, that kind of stuff. It's good to know who's on the meeting tonight, so please do use that chat function. Tonight you'll hear from 4 speakers. Two of our speakers are from the Worker Stories Project team, so Ewan and Ruth, and two of our speakers tonight are from the Workers Educational Association, so WEA, so Joey and Katie from there, who are going to talk a little bit about some of the kind of collaborative work that we've been doing around supporting people is kind of share their stories. But I'll give you a little bit more information about each speaker when I come to introduce them. I also want to give a little bit of a shout out to the other members of the Worker Stories team. So the project is I don't know if you've been on the website yet to sort of checked out our stuff, but really the project is very much a collaborative team effort. And alongside Ewan and Ruth and myself, we've also got Hayley Maxwell, who is an art historian and an activist in the women's movement. We've got Henry Bell, who's a poet, an editor, and an author of John Maclean, Hero of Red Clydeside, and Megan Park, who's a freelance illustrator and also the person behind all the project's kind of beautiful illustrations that you sort of saw as you were coming into the meeting. I'll also be posting sort of links to all our social media pages, all the useful links around how you make submissions, how to contact us via email address. So like I say, there will be important information going in the chat box during the course of the meeting, so just kind of look out for that. Okay, so without kind of any further delay, I'm going to move on to the speakers tonight. I'd firstly like to introduce our first speaker, Ewan Gibbs. So Ewan lectures in economic and social history at Glasgow University. His research interests include work and labour in 20th and 21st century Scotland and workplace politics and protest. He's also really experienced in recording and archiving working class memories through oral histories. So Ewan will really just set out kind of like how the project came about, and also provide a bit of a kind of historical and also contemporary framing around the question, the title of the session tonight, around why worker stories are so important. So I'll hand over to Ewan.
Thanks, Suki. I'm going to answer the question, why do worker stories matter, through three different answers if we want. The first of them is disrupting narratives, the second is writing history, and the third is producing resources. And I think these relate to the project in different ways. So if we start with disrupting narratives, one story that always comes to my mind is a Scottish miners leader who described the experience of the 1984 to 5 strike as similar to his experience on a Sunday morning, that he usually spent reading newspaper reports of football matches he'd attended that he barely recognised. Work is political, and I think it's important that we have an explicitly partisan recording of work during the pandemic. But actually, rather than that story of the misrepresentation of work and worker activism, in reality, the nature of the modern workplace and modern working class experiences are, I think, coloured more by their invisibility. We've lived through the death of industrial correspondence in Britain over the last few decades, and the manual and routine non-manual working class majority in Britain increasingly simply aren't part of the picture when it comes to media and reporting. That's perhaps altered slightly through the course of the pandemic. I think we've been treated to two different images of the modern British worker. The first of those is the white collar consumer who can easily relocate to working from home and work off their own broadband and be coerced back into the office to spend money on Pret a Manger sandwiches as suits them. And the second is the key worker hero who put themselves on the line when the rest of us couldn't or wouldn't. I think worker stories has played an important role in making some of those invisible workers who aren't covered in those categories visible to an extent. So we've had stories published by lorry drivers, supermarket workers, and furloughed travel agent employees. We've also asked questions about what is work. Our view of work isn't limited to wage labour. We've even had stories from children reflecting on their experience of acting as carers. So I think that's important that we're questioning what work is through these stories as well. We've disrupted the heroic narrative too. We've had reflections from care home staff and nurses that relate to the fear and struggles that they've been through in their own workplaces. I think we've had less on collective action, and I think that might be something we want to discuss a bit more tonight. Moving on to writing history. As one of our blog posts said, history's first draft is already being written. And if we look at historical precedents, the initial important portrayals of a period of time, a pivotal changing period of time, tend to stick. If we think about images of the 1930s, we might think of the hunger marches in Britain. We might think of George Orwell's description of the road to Wigan Pier, the experience of unemployment and the drudgery that miners experienced in Britain at the time. We might think about Steinbeck's images or portrayal of the Yokies, the disrupted farmers of the Dust Bowl in The Grapes of Wrath, or Woody Guthrie's songs. Broadly heroic images of ordinary working class people who were displaced by the crisis of capitalism. If we look at the 1970s, we probably see something very different. The images that might come to mind are the Tories' Britain Isn't Working poster, the Winter of Discontent, images of workers as the pawns of union barons, or indeed as the happy consumers of a new liberal market society. I think it's important that we can test how the pandemic is written about, given that these images, these reflections on those periods both became very important going forward in the 1940s and the 1980s. But I'd also say that we don't need more George Orwell's, or at least we need more than that. The value, I think, in workers' stories is we want stories of, but also by workers. I think that also relates to the importance of looking across mediums. Testimonies are very useful and important, but it's also distinctive that we've had access to creative writing. And that relates to my last set of thoughts here on producing resources. So what happens when we're not writing the first draft, but the second or third draft of history? Good historians are led by their sources. And in recent decades, oral histories, recording the thoughts and memories and reflections of workers, former workers, and community members have become an important and popular way of doing labour and working class history. And the value in them lies in recording voices, experiences that don't usually appear in the written historical record, and also the advantage of a historical perspective on those events. But the disadvantage comes from the distance from the period. I think one of the huge values of worker stories is we're accessing workers' composed reflections from the time. So in one sense, then our submissions are raw, but they're also considered works of prosaic writing, arts, and literature. Workers' ideas and reflections are also given bona fide recognition, encouragement, and they're stored online and hopefully in the long run on an archive basis. They'll be available to researchers in the future. And I think that's important because historians want to know what changes in the workplace felt like during the pandemic, how workers reacted, what they thought about, not just what happened. I think in that sense, there's also a lot of value in the individualized nature of these worker stories. We're not representing the workers as simply a corporate or institutionalized agent. We're thinking of them as people with complex lives and their own thoughts. I'm keen to think about, as we go forward in this discussion, then workers' stories as a form of historical practice, what we've done well, but also things that I'm sure we could definitely do better or differently.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. I see people are using the chat function. It's really nice to see people commenting on there and telling us a little bit about who they are and where they are. And it's good to see that there's people from all over kind of in the meeting tonight. So our next speaker is Ruth Gilbert. Ruth is also a member of the Worker Stories project team. Ruth is a PhD researcher and a teaching assistant in film and television and a trade unionist with UCU who campaigns against casualisation in higher education. She has worked in libraries and archives and cultural heritage, and her current research analyses how archives are used in non-fiction film to prioritise underrepresented histories. So Ruth's going to tell us a little bit about where we are with the project so far, and also where we hope to kind of take the project going forward. So I'll hand over to Ruth.
Hi there. Thanks for that, Suki and Ewan, and thanks to everyone for coming along. So just to kind of outline where we are with the project at the moment, since we started the project in the spring, we've been receiving and publishing stories every week, and super links to the online archive so far and the formalities of the submission process. But the call out for the project was and remains open to submissions from workers across Scotland in any kind of work and in any format that best captures their experiences. We've tried to be explicit about our call to document all kinds of labour during this crisis, not placing value judgments on what constitutes work within wage structures or specific types of employment. Since we published our first submission from a postal worker in June, I think as Ewan mentioned, we've shared stories from educators, logistics workers, retail and hospitality, trade unionists, transport workers, the arts, and health and social care. So alongside these more visible forms of labour, we were also keen to get insights into the less seen forms of essential work and to hear from those with caring responsibilities and those who are under or unemployed or losing work as a result of this crisis. So we've had a range of submissions so far, from straightforward personal accounts to more experimental writing, drawings, film and sound pieces. And we've been really pleased with the responses so far, which have been moving and sometimes funny and painful, but all really important documents of this time. And for me, one of the most urgent pieces was from 12-year-old Hannah Angus, who had to step up to caring duties within her family. And through the process of her committing her story to the page, she identified her position as an essential but unpaid worker and reflected on her contribution and the lack of support for carers across the country. So these working class stories are critical, both as historical documents, but also in evaluating the impact of this crisis in a personal capacity. So I singled out Hannah's story there just as one example, but the experiences of all workers during a time of crisis or rupture throw aspects of our labour that we had come to accept as the norm into much sharper relief when the difficulties of the day-to-day become exceptional or urgent. And as we move into the longer term effects and come to terms with where we are, these stories become essential documents of history and they should be prioritised as such. So I'm sure when we move into the discussion, we can look at how and why these stories of the often hidden, unpaid or low paid or even traditionally gendered labour just aren't getting the same level of attention that they should be, both before and since this crisis. But in terms of the fundamentals of the project and the longevity of collecting and publishing stories, we've had discussions about what the end might look like. And so after the immediate period of more intense lockdown began to ease, we decided to keep accepting stories for as long as workers kept sending them in. Obviously, the massive uncertainty around lockdown easing and restrictions changing, as well as some of the changes becoming more permanent realities for workers, has extended the collecting stage of the project through the winter and maybe beyond. And after this time, we'll evaluate how we could exhibit it beyond the website. So this could be in several different forms. It could be a touring exhibition or similar, a physical publication, hopefully as well. But that'll all depend on where we find ourselves. We'll also eventually archive the collected stories at the National Library of Scotland, which will form part of their permanent collection. We've been in ongoing discussion with the archivist who manages political and trade union collections and the archives of artists at the NLS. So they'd gotten in touch with us to let us know they'd seen the project and were looking to collect the archives of groups and organisations who were documenting COVID-19 in Scotland. And their view was looking towards representing the experiences of people across the country, and perhaps those experiences that might not usually be represented outside of institutional settings. So this quite naturally ties in with the rationale around collecting and documenting histories from below. The aim has always been to make space for workers to share their own stories rather than have those stories be co-opted or framed through an institution or what can sometimes be exclusionary artistic or publishing channels. But then it's obviously relevant to house that collection appropriately for future generations and for the historical record. So the NLS have been really generous in offering to support us through that process and house the archive. But before we get to that stage, it's up to us to make that as rich and varied as possible. So we're not finished yet, and we'll continue to reflect while we go and welcome feedback to, I think as Ewan said, maybe recognise some of the gaps where we could do more. Just to finish up and I'll stop talking, some of you may be here who are considering a submission and others might want to find out how they can help, and some might want to do both, and all of that's really great. So we're really keen to reach areas that we haven't managed to yet, both in geographic terms and in terms of the stories that have been shared so far and where we're missing. When we look through the submissions, some things like jump out. It's quite Central Belt heavy, which isn't surprising based on where we all are. There's a lot of industries we haven't touched on yet. I think there was some that we were maybe expecting to hear from that we didn't, and I'm sure that says other things about the visibility of certain kinds of work, what we think of as essential key work or work at all. So we'd really encourage anyone who would like to be involved in sharing the project more widely to get in touch, or if you want to submit and need some support to get in touch. We're really happy to support in any way we can. And if you're active in your union branch or workplace and would like some information from us, or would like someone from the project team to come along to your next meeting, we're really more than happy to do that. So we'd be accepting and sharing submissions over the coming months and building towards the archive that we mentioned. So I think that's me. Thanks for listening, and I will pass back to Suki.
Thanks, Ruth. So I've just popped in the chat just while Ruth was chatting there, just some links to our website. There are direct links there to more information around how you actually submit and the appropriate kind of consent forms, all that kind of stuff. So if you are thinking about it, just check out that information in the chat box during or after at the end of the meeting. I'm now going to pass on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is Katie Hastie, who is a writer, an editor, and creative writing tutor from Glasgow. She's on the editorial board of Gutter magazine and has been working with the WEA on writing courses responding to the pandemic since March. So like I say, we've been doing collaborative work with the WEA, and both Katie and Joey have been running various different workshops. So I'll let them tell you a bit more about what it is that they've been doing to support the work. So I'll hand over to Katie just now. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Suki, and thanks, well, everyone from the Workers' Stories Project. I think it's been a really vital resource for me personally, as well as a lot of the learners I'm working with. So my role is I'm a creative writing tutor with the WEA, and so for me, I kind of consider that like just the special kind of way that we can create a creative community, give people kind of permission to unlock that their own imaginations and just kind of let it watch it happen. I have great creative faith in everyone, really, and I think the pandemic has been pretty brutal and not really left time for people to consider that. There's a real sense that our imaginations are a luxury, or creative work can be a luxury, and I love this project for validating everyone's perspective, everyone's autonomy and agency in creating their own work. So it's not just oral testimonies, it's also very experimental work. So with the WEA, I have been working on various like pandemic themed, creative writing themed and well-being themed classes. I'm about to start one next week based on unwaged and unemployed workers within Glasgow. And mainly these are creative writing circles where we gather, we share our ideas about part of the pandemic or how we're feeling about it. And we're able to try and break down such a colossal, epic experience into basically smaller sections that we can talk about. And gradually I think we get to share ideas as people, and from that kind of inspire each other to write a little bit more. So this can just be very basic, just writing during the Zoom session, or it can be starting to build up a bigger habit of journaling perhaps, or spending more time during your week thinking about your creative practice. I've been really inspired in this regard by a poet and activist in North America who wrote a poem just around the start of the pandemic called Eli Clare. And he has this line at the end of his poem from April 1st called, we cannot afford to lose our ability to imagine. And it really struck me as a very powerful concept. It links up in my mind with like the kind of wisdom that came from other poets like Audre Lorde and others who have lived through very brutal experiences and found their creativity is actually a really powerful political tool, an act of truth telling, and an act of kind of self-liberation. I think it has that potential. It's a difficult thing to think about. People often put the arts and work sort of in opposition to each other, and I love how this project brings those two things together. Personally, I've seen the effect on individual learners when they see their work being shared, when they read stories like theirs, and just as a living kind of chorus of voices and such diverse voices and diverse experiences, I think it's already done a lot of good for people to feel validated, encouraged, and just that little bit braver in voicing how they feel. We're living through times where we're very, very alienated from each other. It's hard to find that solidarity. And I think this project has really found cross-sectoral, cross-class solidarity. And I think it's brought people together, even as it recognises their differences. So for me as a tutor, I think this has been an extraordinary outlet and a brilliant opportunity for the students to share their work and read other work that could really resonate with them. So.
Thank you, Katie. And just a big thank you to yourself for the work that you have done around supporting the project. We really appreciate it. And actually the classes sound great, and I actually would love to have been on one of the courses as well. If there are upcoming courses that you're doing, then again, please use the chat function just to advertise them. Look out for them on the WEA website and social media pages, but also on the Worker Stories social media pages as well, because we do regularly advertise anything coming up. So I will now hand over to our final speaker. So our final speaker is Joey Simmons. Joey is a writer, he's a WEA tutor, and he's an active Living Rent member in Glasgow. So alongside Katie, I mean, he's been delivering a range of different workshops as well. And like we say, a lot of that work that they've been engaging in has really helped support the work of the project in terms of supporting people to share their stories. So again, we kind of really welcome their input. So without further ado, I'll kind of hand over to Joey as well.
Thank you. So yeah, just to echo what everyone else has said about the project so far, and it's good. It's been good to be a part of it. And yeah, just in terms of the courses I've run, it's kind of interesting from what people are saying. It was initially kind of based on the US kind of labour organiser, educator and painter Ralph Fasanella. He's kind of a self-trained and self-taught artist from the Bronx, grew up in an immigrant family in New York. And then they've ended up training as a painter after injuring his hand in a workplace accident. And yeah, one of his union colleagues suggested that he should take up painting as, to help with his hand, and he kind of started from there. And it was just interesting looking at his life, because the way Fasanella really looked at his art was as a kind of collective act that was kind of produced from his community, from fellow workers, and it was in the service of that, while at the same time recognising the individuality of the people he saw around him. And he said that he knew every single person that appeared in all of his paintings. And I came across a wee thing that was produced by the Communication Workers Union of in America, I think in the 1980s. That was like an educator's guide to using Fasanella's paintings with young people, with workers in the workplace, with families, that had a whole kind of range of different like activities, writing exercises, mapping exercises, timelines, poetry ideas based on his painting. And yeah, it was kind of an amazing resource, and it did make me think, you know, that seemed almost inconceivable that would happen in the current period. And in a way, you know, the Workers' Stories project is amazing in the sense that a small group of people has come up with this and been able to do it. But, you know, almost in the absence of kind of wider working class institutions, you know, that other times might have taken this up. So yeah, for me, it's like the idea was to do kind of the writing classes, you know, around the Workers' Stories project, to try and ground that act of writing and recording people's experiences as something collective rather than just individual, you know, and it was a process that, you know, we had to kind of practice and to work through together, rather than just this kind of individual act of creation that people were expected to have. So the classes, I done much less than Katie, but the classes we did do were interesting. And kind of one of the things that ended up emerging and which I focused on was, so in a way, it was drawing out the continuities to what had happened before, rather than seeing the pandemic as this kind of like, you know, like inexplicable change in what had been happening. So we kind of focused a lot just like on little writing exercises about, you know, what hasn't changed, or about timelines, and even like looking like some of the, just like the poetry that I use, like from Brecht and from Tom Leonard, and finding these descriptions that seem almost exactly of the pandemic, but have obviously emerged from a completely different time, and kind of using those to help people kind of explain and share and record their own experiences. And I think kind of for me, is this idea of duration is really important, that to build a Workers' Stories project and to build, you know, worker writing, it takes, you know, like institutional support, it takes collective resources, and it takes time. And as the North American poet Mark Novak led the kind of workers' writers school with domestic workers, like the CAB union in the United States, you know, he's really emphasised this. The workers' writing school has been successful because they're there week after week after week, you know, for years and years, building up these relationships with workers, building up that trust and respect, you know, and that's kind of what's required in order for this to really continue and to be worthwhile, not just a kind of one-off event, you know. So I think, yeah, it's been amazing so far, but for me, it's really the seeds of something that we need to expand much more widely, and hopefully beyond the pandemic as well. Cheers.
Thanks, Joey. And I think Joey and actually all the speakers have touched upon the importance of workers telling their stories themselves, and that's something that we definitely wanted to stress with this project, because I think you get a lot of work out there where people are writing on behalf of working class people, and we don't necessarily have enough spaces where working class people themselves are getting the opportunity to share their own stories in their own way and their own distinct styles. So that's definitely been, you know, really central to the work of the project. So again, just, you know, thanking Joey and Katie for helping to support that work through the workshops that they've been engaged in. So thank you for that. We are now, everyone's been keeping to time. I'm really so happy about this. So it's really good. It means that we do have a bit of time for a little bit of a discussion, a little bit of Q&A. So what I'm going to do is, I think the easiest way to maybe facilitate that is, if people want to come in and ask a question, could you maybe just post in the chat, just post your name in the chat, and it just means that I can bring people in turn, as opposed to putting your hands up. So if you want to ask a question, it can be anything about how to submit a story, a bit more about you know, how the project came about, or any aspect of what the speakers have already discussed. Please just hit us with your questions, and we're happy to answer them. So like I say, use the chat function and I can bring people in. Don't be shy. This is a bit where everyone's shy. Don't worry, I've got some questions for the panelists just in case. Okay, we've got one. So Cleo, do you want to come in?
Sorry, I've not been in many Zoom meetings. So can you hear me now?
Yep, perfect.
So I guess I'm a wardrobe assistant. I was a wardrobe assistant. So I think the reason I found out about this was I had written a few things online, like about everything that had been happening backstage with sort of backstage workers. I didn't really think about it for a long time. I don't think many of us did. Like, I think at the beginning of the pandemic, like loads of people that were working in kind of like non-essential jobs, like most of us, all we felt was guilt, you know what I mean, about that we weren't working. So none of us really worried about our own jobs in the beginning. And I think basically, not just with our theatre, but with a lot of theatres, by the time we had actually even thought about ourselves, the management had hung us all out to dry, basically, you know. And I have got a lot to say about it, but I won't say it all now. But I guess one of my questions is about how specific it's appropriate to be, because I've started thinking about it and I've started writing about it, but anything I write is quite clearly scathing to specific people. So it's like, and there's no secret about it, because our theatre was in sort of fights with the union about it. But I just don't know, how specific to be within what happened in our workplace, because, you know, it's they have, what they've done is taken the pandemic as an excuse to fire everyone, and at every point they never waited to hear what the Rishi Sunak was going to announce. They fired us all before, and even now we could still be working there. And yeah, I don't know how, whether to mention the actual place that I work or whether to make it like vague, and then also about whether I just don't know. I don't know how
Yeah.
to.
That's perfect. No, and actually that's a really good question, because I think that question is something a lot of people think about, and it can be the difference between whether or not people feel comfortable enough to come forward and submit a story, or they hold back and they don't. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to let some of the panelists come in. I don't necessarily have to take every panelist for every question, but if there's someone maybe from the Worker Stories team that wants to come in and answer that. Ruth, you want to come in? And then Katie, I'll bring yourself in as well. Perfect.
Yeah, thanks, Cleo. I think I've heard that from a few people that were interested in submitting that I know personally, and then haven't gone through with it, and then maybe are just sitting on it for a wee while to let some of this stuff settle in. Particularly, I think something I totally forgot to mention while I was delivering all the info on the project is that people can submit anonymously, and we have had anonymous submissions. So if you were interested in, you know, not diluting your experiences, but there's very legitimate reasons that you've described that somebody might not want to identify their boss or their workplace. So that's absolutely something that we're completely fine with. And those experiences of people submitting anonymously or named tell us a lot about the conditions that people are working under. So that forms part of the sort of analysis that could be done on the project afterwards. So no easy answer to your question. And I know it's one that a lot of people have struggled with, depending on their situation at work, their precarity, their relationship, their union representation, all of these things. But rest assured, that's something we can discuss via email if you want more kind of specific help with that.
Well, that was sort of the second part of the question, was just like, is it, can you be in touch with advice about your submission before you submit it? Like, because
yeah, you can. You can send it in. You can then decide to retract it. We keep all the submissions securely in a database, and then there'll be a period of time between the submission and it going out where we'd always email in advance of that to let you know it's being published. So we have had people send things in and then want to amend them, and that's absolutely fine. It's your work so we'd honour that. Does that answer the question okay?
Yeah, yeah.
Cleo, I just want to say thank you for asking that question, because I think it really lies at the heart of the decisions that so many people are experiencing, and I think that's a really generous and brave thing to do. So I just want to say thank you for asking that.
No,
I
it's
think
fine. It's just about other people that still work there. That's the thing. Is a lot of people have quit or been made redundant or taken voluntary redundancy, but you know your other like colleagues are hating having to go back there when something like this has happened. Like, you know, if it's been a drama or whatever, it's like you don't want to put them in a position where you're highlighting.
I mean, I think, was it Rosa Luxemburg says, like, you only know power lines when you cross them. So you know exactly the power structures that you're up against, and especially in the culture industry that are even before this, like to say, you know, to continue the idea that Joey said of things that are continuous and were there already. Like, it was already really hard to speak out in the theatre world, and this has just made it, because it's quite a small world, it makes it even harder. So I really think you're raising an important point. I just wanted to offer that there's a lot around the trauma of this and honouring your truth of it, and I don't mean that to diminish it. I think that's a political act as well. I think that's political and personal at the same time. I think it's structural and psychological at the same time, and I just wanted to offer that there's so much value in the way that you're speaking out, even if it's in blogs or to friends, or even if it's in journals to yourself. That stuff is hugely beneficial. And I like the Worker Story Project for putting all the agency on you, what you decide to do next with that. But I just wanted to offer that I think writing it for yourself is hugely important. Writing to honour your truth of this is massively important. I just wanted to offer that long term that might help. Just even to not feel gaslit by the whole thing, and just know that you're not on your own a bit. So yeah, I hope you do write it for yourself, and then whatever decision you take after that will be yours.
Thanks.
Thank you, Cleo. I'll also put our email address in the chat as well, so you know how to reach us. But it's also in the links that I've put out as well. The next question, I don't know if Neil wants to come in, but he's posted a question in there, so if you can have a wee look at the chat. But essentially he's asking, so dirty hands work versus office and home-based work, have you had much provided that's not by people on the tool, so to speak? So Ewan, do you want to cover that maybe in terms of what we've had in?
The short answer is yes. We've had quite a good range of different experiences. So we've had definite workplace experiences in the context of workplaces that have stayed open or even been at the centre of the pandemic. So we've had reflections from care homes and hospitals. We've also had reflections from workers that have in some ways kept doing their job. So retail workers, logistics workers, lorry drivers have been part of that story. But we have also had reflections from workers who've either been furloughed or transitioned to working at home. I think what's been quite interesting about those reflections is they've reflected on the difficulties of working from home, of the pressures of being distant from their workmates, in some ways of having intensified workloads. But sometimes they've also commented favourably on elements of working from home as well, and there isn't necessarily communicating through those stories a desire to go back to the way the world was before working from home kicked in. So I think we have had those quite different sets of stories. I think it's been really important actually having what we might call manual worker experiences, especially those from outside the heroic, heroised health and social care sector, because their experience of the pandemic hasn't been very well covered, I don't think, in the press or in popular consciousness. But I think the experiences we've had, the reflections we've had on experiences of furlough have been quite important, and especially on working from home and you know, questions being raised about what the preferable future might look like for white collar workers too.
Okay, thanks, Ewan. I've got a comment from Colin Clark, a comment, not a question, which is welcome also. And it's also just about, so he talks about encouraging his brother to submit stories, and it's really just to say that that if you can do that, if you can reach out to other people around your periphery, your friends, your family, people that you work with, and encourage people to share stories if they need help with it, we're, like I say, we're more than happy to do so. There's loads of different ways that you can submit the stories as well, and we talk a lot about them on the website in terms of not just written pieces, you know, but videos, audios, drawings. Our very first worker story project was just like a, you know, a little doodle drawing. It's probably one of my favourites, but it's brilliant. Go on the website and check it out. But if people need a little bit of encouragement, then we're happy to do that. If you're able to do that also with the people you know, then we definitely welcome that. Also think about how you can help facilitate that as well. So, you know, people interviewing each other, I think, is a really good technique as well. Sometimes that can be quite encouraging. As long as we hear directly from workers themselves, I think we can find loads of different ways to sort of get those stories out and sort of help people to share in a much more kind of confident way. So have a wee think about that. And like I say, there's more online about it. Let me see what else is there. Quick question. Is there a deadline for submissions? Jill, we don't currently have a deadline for submissions. I think a short while back we did think about the next steps of the project. Are we starting to bring it to a close? But obviously we know that the pandemic doesn't look like it's ending anytime soon. We know that the issues that workers face continue to be really challenging. We want to continue hearing people's stories. We don't have a deadline yet for the project. When we do, we will obviously we will publicise that, but no, plenty of time just now to submit, so you don't need to worry about any deadlines. Okay, does anyone else have a question just now? I can pose a question to the panel.
There was Thomas, I think.
Sorry.
Thomas? Yeah. Just need to unmute. Oh, hold on, let me just see.
Hello?
Yeah, perfect, thank you.
Hello. Hi. Well, it's kind of following on for what you were saying there regarding kind of trying to tease people's stories out. I live in a very small community. I live in Orkney. It's very tight-knit. And yeah, do you have any other kind of ways of, because I mean, I've actually got a couple of posters from Hayley because I know her. So I've been putting them up and stuff, but yeah, I was just wondering if you had any other ways of kind of making people see. Yeah, it's hard to get them to talk sometimes, which I'm sure you understand, but obviously in these kind of very small places and as a person of color, it's very hard as well, but yeah.
Thank you for asking that. Katie, I think you had your hand up there, so maybe.
I was going to also, I think you should maybe call in Joey's ideas here as well, but this is going to sound totally trite, but I think writer circles right now are hugely important. That's been an amazing working class writing tool for a century or more. Right now, people are pretty lonely. Even in a tight-knit community, maybe there's not that sense of connection the way there was before. So I find writing circles are actually pretty attractive for people right now. Online is quite handy. I think it's a combination sometimes of finding the time, finding the voice, and we are braver when we do it together. So here's my recommendation. If you were able to get the word out that there was like a Zoom call where you just put on some music and just let people write for an hour, or you came up with one writing prompt, today we're going to write about masks, or today we're going to write about anxiety, or today we're going to write about, I don't know, the coronavirus briefings, or just like some random topic. I find just like one prompt and then giving people space in their day, because we book in these Zoom meetings all the time, but what happens if you just put on some nice music, everyone just turned their cameras off even, you know, and you just sat and wrote together. It's quite powerful, even for 45 minutes or an hour, and just see how you go. Maybe if you start with like maybe 4 or 5 pals, and then maybe word might spread. But I think people are looking for quality connection and entertainment right now because we're all bored and really tired. I think given the opportunity, some people might let that out a wee bit. That's my thought.
That's awesome. Thank you so much. That's really useful. Yeah.
Just
Thanks, Katie. Joy?
Just one thing I did that worked quite well. Well, I just used all these quotes from Rishi Sunak, which kind of extracted were quite poetic. But one of his from July was like, "It's vital people aren't returning just for the sake of it. They need to be doing decent work." And then, yeah, one of the participants, they kind of just spoke to the other people in their work and just asked them this question, like, what is decent work? And then they kind of created a poem out of like the responses from people. And there was like another wee thing I seen, it's from some like 70s art thing, but basically people interviewed people they knew and asked them, what do I do? And then recorded what people said. So it was interesting. I can send the exercises, but I think things like that, again, where it's a bit more collective or participative, or, you know, it's not like saying, right, you need to go and sit down for 20 minutes, but even you can kind of take it and integrate their experience or their words, you know, into your submission or something like that, you know, I think can be, yeah, work quite well with some of the learners. But yeah, I don't think there's an easy answer necessarily, but definitely if you, that's the thing though, if you do one and it goes up, that's probably the best thing you can do to get others to do it, that you know.
Thank you.
Definitely, and just as Ruth mentioned before, we're also happy to come out and do a wee 5 minute, 2 minute to any groups of friends or people that you know, or you know, any groups that you might be involved in, just to talk a little bit about what the project is, answer people's questions. We're more than happy to do that. This is a wee bit of an odd request, Thomas, but see the pictures that you're putting up, the posters. I know it sounds odd, but we really want photos of the posters in different locations across Scotland that we can then share. I think it encourages other people as well. So if you could email us any photos, I know the weather's not great, but that would be really helpful. And I know that there's people from all over in the meeting tonight, so if people do want posters, we do still have a batch of posters. We're happy to send you in the post, so do email us and we'll get them out to you as well. And I think Neil's also posted some stuff in the chat that might be useful to you, Thomas, around local groups, getting involved in those in areas like Orkney and Fort William, that kind of thing. Is there any other questions? Anyone? I mean, I had questions for the panelists, but I feel that if I ask these questions, it might open up a huge, oh, look, yes, we have someone. So I hope I pronounced this right. Is it Mick? Is it Mick? Or totally?
It's Micah. It's fine. I was just wondering, like, following on from what has been said so far, what kind of strategies have you been using to get in contact with people, or how did you I mean, that sounds a bit stupid and you have touched a bit on it, but how have you gotten the submissions you have? I was just wondering, and maybe also something about the responses you had, like, do people really have sort of an urgency to communicate their experiences? So I was just wondering about that.
Perfect. So maybe one for you and Ruth.
Yeah, I'm happy to go through that. A lot of the submissions we had were just on spec from people that had seen posts on social media and had written in, and then we did have a database that we contacted in the early stages of the project based on community groups and trade union branches that we knew to kind of get that out there. But again, it's something that we really acknowledge is the kind of limited reach that we've had so far. So that's why events like this are really important in terms of spreading that. Sorry, what was the second part of your question? It's just totally slipped my mind.
Sorry. Yeah, if you had the sense that there was sort of an urgency that people really wanted to tell their stories, or felt the need of, Yeah,
it's been interesting because at the start we had reflections that were in that really acute part of the crisis where we were in lockdown, and there was I think Katie's touched on quite a lot of the immediate trauma that came with that. And then as we moved into the different stages of lockdown, there were reflections of people kind of settling into what people have referred to as the new normal or the more established practices of this. And then we're coming out the other side of that now and seeing people return to the early stages. We had a piece recently from a supermarket worker who had documented their experience of being at work at the beginning when everybody was going mad stockpiling, and they didn't submit that until later in the summer. So they'd kind of reflected on it after the fact. So we've had quite a range, and we don't have any particular remit about things being immediate reflections. We're quite happy for people to take the time to write in the moment, to write about a broad expanse of time. It's really up to the worker that's writing in to set those parameters. I don't know if Ewan wants to add anything, or Katie or Joey.
I suppose just in relation to the second question, I think Ruth answered the first one. There is a sense that I think this has provided a forum for people who maybe did want to say something, but maybe didn't actually really put it in those terms. You know, certainly weren't going to set up their own blog, but when it was put in front of them that there was an archive, there was an effort to record these memories, it chimed with them, and it made these efforts seem worthwhile. And that's quite common in my experience of doing oral histories, is similarly telling people that their lives and their experiences were actually interesting and worth recording and of historical relevance made that the case. So I think one of the lessons I take from this is when you tell people that these things are worthwhile, they're much more likely to reciprocate.
I was actually going to refer back to something Ewan said at the beginning about people reacting to the way that they're represented in the media. Exactly as Ewan was saying, like, I've physically been in a call and explained this to someone or put a post up about Worker Stories Project and watched their whole being change because they know that someone wants to listen to them. Communication's not a one-way thing, it's a two-way thing, and if you know that someone is listening to you, you feel just much more empowered to say it. I've got a couple of people on the call just now who come from a series of creative writing classes I'm running with Unison, and ostensibly they were started out because Unison wanted to provide creative writing classes for its members, but having told them about the Worker Story Project, it's just such an inviting idea. They've come along this evening, and that's kind of proof, I think, a little of just like the urgency people are feeling. There's this, at a time of silence and separation, there is this like groundswell of feeling about this and experiences that this is tapping into and allowing it to come out. I wonder what we would be without this, actually.
And I think the first part of the question though is really interesting as well, because I mean, in the Worker Story in the kind of first blog put up, you know, they used the example of kind of groups of conscious workers like approaching artists to kind of document, you know, certain struggles like Caterpillar or, you know, UCS or whatever it was. And in a way, this is quite different. In a way, it's like we're not documenting a period of struggle in terms of conscious working class struggle or, you know, a political struggle in the sense that it's like emerged from movement with specific aims. It's this, in a way, quite unique and weird relationship between workers, you know, the workers' movement as it is, the archive, media, individual submissions, you know. So I think that is interesting. It's like, you know, the self-selection process or how, and I think that kind of reflects this whole period. And what Ewan said at the start, you know, is not a lot of submissions about, you know, collective acts or resist, you know, because that has not really been a feature of this period in a way. It's just this kind of, it's just trying to ideologically navigate what is happening. And I think in terms of the urgency, there's definitely been different waves in classes I've done where, you know, people are sick of it, or then there is this urgency. And then, you know, so I think that first question is going to be really interesting to see, you know, how the archive ends up and that relationship. Because yeah, in a way it's quite different from what's gone before, you know, but in itself, you know, it could be a partisan act, you know, that shows that's possible. You know, it could have a different kind of value or different relationship in the future. But yeah, I think there's definitely a lot to think through there. So it'll be interesting to see, like at the end of the project, what it looks like in a way.
Thanks, Joey. I'm going to take, I know we're coming up to past. I'm going to take one last question from James. I'll give, yeah, because I don't want to cut anyone off. So James, do you want to ask your question?
Hi there, Suki. It's a political question, I'm afraid. And I guess it kind of relates to the question of class consciousness. And I guess I'm wondering, where do you think that is at around these issues right now? Because it seemed to me at the beginning of the pandemic, there was a break from this idea of the entrepreneur and the financier and so on as the wealth creator. We had everyone clapping for the NHS workers. We had a great deal of consciousness around the role that essential workers were playing in the economy and so forth. But it does seem to me that since then, there has been a degree of institutional capture again by the sort of ruling bloc of capitalists in society. very quickly, Nicola Sturgeon handed over the economic recovery from coronavirus, the report around that, to what was essentially a very traditional gang of the capitalist elite, and a few aristocrats to boot in Scotland, plus Graham Smith of the STUC, of which I will say nothing. So they seem to get away with that mode of representation where the economy was once again associated with the old-fashioned, quote-unquote, wealth creators of the traditional Scottish bourgeoisie. And I don't really think that's a problem that's just to do with Scotland and the national question and the degree to which it obscures other class contradictions. I think this sort of recovery has gone on in a lot of other societies around the planet as well. And obviously a great deal of money is essentially just being handed to businesses willy-nilly with few guarantees for workers at the minute. And again, I don't think that's just a thing that's to do with Britain. So I was wondering, how do you reflect on these questions? And are we going to be in a situation relatively similar to after 2008, where they were just able to hand the reins back, essentially, to traditional elites? Or do you see new modes of working class expression playing some role in this emerging political settlement?
What a nice big question to finish us off, James Foley. Ewan, do you want to take that on? Are you happy to come back on some of that first initially?
Okay, I mean, something that I thought about Cleo's story is that is a story of class struggle. Like, we are living through a class struggle. It's just a class struggle that's being waged from above, and it's quite important that we think about that if we're thinking about class struggles. And the story that Cleo told about the creative arts sector is also happening in other sectors. I'm part of a project at the moment to do with the restructuring of the Rolls-Royce factory in Shinnon, and 700 engineers have just taken voluntary redundancy. And interestingly, quite similarly to the story that was told here earlier, a lot of the engineers, when we did the survey, refused to call it voluntary redundancy. They've referred to it as compulsory redundancy. And in quite similar terms to the way that Rishi Sunak and the Conservative Party is telling creative arts workers, highly skilled professionals who've, developed their skill set over years to be part of a globally competitive sector. These engineers are being told the same thing. They're being told to retrain or even forget it and join another sector. My hope is that at minimum, workers' stories will record these experiences on the terms of the other side. I hope that it goes one further, and we aren't recording, as is usually the case in labour history, the memories of the class that was defeated in class struggles. But I think at least we can do that. We can provide the perspective of important experiences, and I hope for that reason that we get some of those experiences of redundancy and restructuring in particular in our submissions.
Thanks, Ewan. And Ewan's right. I mean, you touched upon it. I think that the ability to share your story with other people, with other workers, is an incredibly powerful act. And I think that more that we can do to raise people's confidence around that inevitably raises people's class consciousness as well, because what we're asking people to do in a really powerful way is to tell their everyday stories. Tell your everyday stories about life and work. And it's not just for people just now, but it's for people that will come after us in years to come. And I think that in itself is a great act of solidarity, about ensuring that working class voices have a platform, that people are around to hear those stories, and that this important period at the minute is told, and it's told most importantly, most fundamentally, by the people who create the wealth in society, the people who run our society, all that kind of stuff. So hopefully the stories that we generate is able to sort of contribute to that. So yes, very important question at the end. Unless any other speaker wants to come back, I think what I'm going to do is just round up, because we have just gone slightly over, and it's really just a reminder to people. I have put all the important kind of links to the project in the group chat, all the social media pages, how to submit stories, what we're looking for, how to do that, how to contact us via email. All this stuff is out there, and like we say, if you are involved in any trade union branches, any community groups, tenants organisations, any sort of groups where you would like someone from the Workers' Stories project to come out, maybe just say a couple of things about what we're doing with the project, then we are more than happy to do that. I think if everyone here could go away and speak to people, in your periphery, your colleagues, friends, family, all that kind of thing, then please do encourage people to tell their story. And like I say, we're more than happy to support people to do that as well. So I think that's us for tonight. Again, just a thank you for taking time out of your evening. We hope that this was helpful and you know, that you found it useful, and certainly we'd be keen to do more events if people thought that would be helpful to sort of continue some of these discussions. Then we're more than happy to facilitate that as well. But I think that's us for tonight, folks. Thank you for coming along, and we'll just close the event there. Thank you.